My name is Margaret, and I'm 34 years old. Growing up, I always believed that families stick together through thick and thin. But sometimes the people closest to you can surprise you in the worst possible ways. My younger brother Harold had always been charming, always knew exactly what to say to make everyone believe he was the devoted son. For months after our father's funeral, he convinced our entire extended family that I was just the irresponsible sister who never really understood family duty. Then came that family dinner that changed everything forever. What happened next, and what I discovered hidden in my father's old filing cabinet, will shock you. Before we dive into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you're ready to hear how I turned the tables on my manipulative brother, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories. Trust me, what I pulled out of that manila folder left everyone speechless. Let me take you back to the beginning so you understand exactly how we got to that explosive dinner. My childhood with my younger brother Harold was pretty typical for siblings born 2 years apart. We grew up in this beautiful 2-story colonial house in suburban Ohio, the kind of place where neighbors actually knew each other's names and kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. Our parents were Vernon and Eleanor, and they were the kind of couple that made you believe in true love. Dad worked as an accountant for 35 years at the same firm, never missed a day, unless one of us kids was sick. Mom stayed home with us when we were little, then worked part-time at the local library once we started school. They saved every penny to buy that house when I was 7, and Harold was 5, and it became the center of our universe. From early on, our personalities couldn't have been more different. I was the responsible one, the kid who did homework without being asked, and helped Mom with dishes after dinner. Harold was the charmer, the one who could talk his way out of trouble with a smile and a joke. While I was studying to become a registered nurse, Harold was bouncing between different colleges, changing his major 3 times, before finally dropping out to pursue what he called opportunities in California. When Mom got diagnosed with cancer 3 years ago, guess who moved back home to help with appointments and treatments? Me. Harold sent flowers and called every few weeks, but he was always too busy with his latest business venture to visit. I took leave from my job at the hospital to be Mom's caretaker during her final months. Harold showed up for the funeral, played the grieving son perfectly, then flew back to California the next day. After Mom passed, Dad aged 10 years in 6 months. His diabetes got worse, his blood pressure spiked, and he started having episodes where he'd get confused and disoriented. Once again, I moved back into my childhood bedroom to take care of him. I'd work my nursing shifts when I could, but mostly I was Dad's full-time caregiver. Harold would call maybe once a month, always promising to visit soon, but never actually booking a flight. Dad's heart attack came suddenly on a Tuesday morning in March. I found him in his study, slumped over the desk, where he paid bills every month for 40 years. The paramedics said it was massive, that he probably didn't suffer. Harold arrived 2 days later, just in time for the funeral arrangements I'd already made. Here's where things started getting weird. During the week Harold stayed for the funeral, he kept making these casual comments about the house. He'd walk through rooms saying things like, "I'll probably want to update this kitchen," or "This place needs new carpeting." When I asked what he meant, he'd just shrug and say we'd figure it out later. I figured we'd split everything 50-50. That's what seemed fair, right? But Harold had different ideas. After the funeral guests left, he started talking about the house like it was already his. He'd mention plans for renovations, talk about how the property value had increased, even joke about finally having a real estate investment. I was so deep in grief that I didn't really process what was happening at first. I was just trying to get through each day, dealing with lawyers and insurance companies, and the mountain of paperwork that comes after someone dies. Harold seemed to be handling the business side of things, which I was grateful for at the time. But as weeks passed, Harold's attitude became more obvious. He'd refer to it as his house in conversations with friends. He started staying at a hotel instead of in his old bedroom, saying he needed space to think about his plans for the property. When I asked about including me in these plans, he'd get this patronizing look and tell me not to worry about complicated business matters. That's when I decided we needed to have a proper family meeting. I thought if we got everyone together, we could discuss Dad's estate like civilized adults. I had no idea I was about to walk into the biggest betrayal of my life. Planning that dinner felt like preparing for a celebration of Dad's life, a chance for our family to come together and honor his memory while figuring out practical matters. I called everyone Dad would have wanted there: his sister Geraldine, Mom's brother Lloyd, my cousin Janet with her husband Bruce, and even Mrs. Paula from next door, who'd been like family for 20 years. I spent the entire day cooking Dad's favorite foods: pot roast with carrots and potatoes the way Mom used to make it, green bean casserole that Dad always requested for holidays, apple pie from scratch using Mom's recipe, the one she taught me when I was 12. The whole house smelled like Sunday dinners from my childhood, and for a few hours I felt close to both my parents again. Harold showed up right on time, carrying an expensive bottle of wine and wearing the kind of confident smile that used to charm teachers into giving him extensions on late assignments. He hugged everyone, accepted their condolences gracefully, and launched into stories about his successful consulting business in San Diego. He had this way of making everything sound more impressive than it probably was. When Aunt Geraldine arrived, Harold immediately took her coat and guided her to Dad's favorite armchair, playing the perfect host in what I still thought was our shared family home. Uncle Lloyd brought photos of Dad from when they were kids, and Harold gathered everyone around the kitchen table to look through them, telling stories about Dad's sense of humor and work ethic. As we sat down to eat, the conversation naturally turned to memories of Dad. Everyone shared their favorite Vernon stories, and for a while it felt healing and right. Harold was particularly eloquent, talking about Dad's integrity and how he'd taught us both the value of hard work and family loyalty. If I hadn't known better, I would have thought Harold had been around for more than just holidays and funerals. But then Harold started steering the conversation toward the future. He began talking about the house like he was already the decision-maker, mentioning ideas for updating the electrical system and maybe adding a deck. When Cousin Janet asked if we were planning to sell, Harold got this authoritative tone and said they were still evaluating options. I noticed he kept saying "I" instead of "we." I'm thinking about refinishing the hardwood floors. I've been researching the neighborhood market values. I want to honor Dad's memory while making practical decisions. Every sentence made it clearer that Harold saw himself as the sole inheritor. Mrs. Paula, bless her heart, asked directly how we were planning to divide things. Harold smoothly deflected, saying these were complex family matters that would work themselves out naturally. But his body language told a different story. He sat at the head of the table, Dad's old spot, and spoke with the authority of someone who'd already made up his mind. The other family members seemed uncomfortable but didn't want to cause drama at what was supposed to be a memorial dinner. They nodded politely when Harold talked, but I caught Aunt Geraldine and Uncle Lloyd exchanging worried glances when they thought no one was looking. As dinner wound down, Harold's confidence grew stronger. He started talking about timelines and practical considerations, mentioning that he'd need to make decisions soon since he couldn't stay in Ohio indefinitely. The way he said it made it clear that any decisions would be his alone. I felt this growing knot in my stomach, but I kept telling myself that Harold was just processing grief differently than I was. Maybe he needed to feel in control of something after losing both parents. Maybe this was his way of coping with the overwhelming responsibility of settling an estate. But deep down, I was starting to realize that my brother had already decided how this was going to go, and my opinion apparently wasn't part of his plan. The next family gathering happened 2 weeks later, and this time Harold came prepared. He walked in carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the kind of business casual outfit that was supposed to make him look like a serious decision-maker. He'd been staying at the Hampton Inn downtown, claiming he needed quiet space to handle estate matters, but I was starting to suspect he just wanted to avoid having real conversations with me about our parents' wishes. Harold waited until after we'd finished eating before pulling out his portfolio. Inside were printed real estate listings, market analysis reports, and what looked like notes from phone conversations with agents. He spread everything across the dining room table like he was making a business presentation, which I guess he was. "I've got some great news about our property value," he announced using that confident tone that always made adults trust him when we were kids. "The market in this neighborhood has really taken off. Similar houses are selling for around $400,000, and with some basic improvements, we could probably do even better." Our guests looked surprised by how quickly Harold was moving, but he pressed on before anyone could interrupt. He'd clearly rehearsed this whole speech. He talked about comparable sales, about the advantages of selling sooner rather than later, about how Dad would have wanted us to make smart financial decisions rather than getting bogged down in sentimentality. "The house needs work anyway," Harold continued, pointing to a list he'd made of necessary repairs. "New roof within 5 years, the furnace is original. From 1985, the electrical system isn't up to current codes. It makes more sense to sell as is and let the new owners deal with renovations." Uncle Lloyd asked who "we" meant in this scenario, and Harold's answer made my blood run cold. He talked about the proceeds helping him expand his California business, about investment opportunities that Dad would have been excited to support. When pressed about my share, Harold said he'd make sure Maggie gets something appropriate for her contributions. Something appropriate. Like I was hired help who deserved a nice tip. Aunt Geraldine looked uncomfortable. "Harold, shouldn't you and Margaret discuss this privately first?" "We have discussed it," Harold lied smoothly. "Maggie understands that these decisions need to be made by someone with business experience. She's got her nursing career to focus on, and honestly, managing rental property or dealing with home improvements isn't really her thing." I started to protest, but Harold kept talking, explaining how he'd already contacted 3 real estate agents for market evaluations. He'd researched property management companies in case we decided to rent instead of sell. He had spreadsheets showing potential return on investment for different scenarios. The most infuriating part was how reasonable he made it all sound. He presented himself as the responsible brother handling complicated financial matters while protecting his emotional sister from having to make difficult decisions. To everyone else at that table, it probably looked like Harold was stepping up to handle a burden I couldn't manage. But I knew the truth. Harold wasn't protecting me from anything. He was systematically cutting me out of decisions about property that legally belonged to both of us. Or at least that's what I thought at the time. "I've already told my friends back home that I'll finally have some real equity to work with," Harold said, grinning like this was all just exciting business opportunity. "Dad always said real estate was the best investment, and now I can finally put that advice to use." My friends, my equity, my investment. Harold had already rewritten the story in his head, and apparently he'd been sharing that story with people 3,000 miles away. When the evening ended, Harold packed up his real estate documents like he'd just closed a successful business deal. He thanked everyone for their support during this difficult time and promised to keep them updated on his progress with the estate. After our guests left, I tried one more time to have an honest conversation with my brother. I asked him directly why he was making all these decisions without including me. His response was the moment I finally understood who Harold really was. "Maggie, you're a good person, but you don't understand business. Dad knew that. He raised me to handle these kinds of responsibilities." Then he looked me straight in the eye and said, "You took care of them when they were dying. Now it's my job to handle what they left behind." Like caring for our parents had been my hobby, and real decision-making was men's work. That night, after Harold went back to his hotel, I sat in Dad's study and cried harder than I had since the funeral. Not just from grief, but from the crushing realization that my own brother saw me as nothing more than a convenient caregiver who'd outlived her usefulness. But crying wasn't going to solve anything. If Harold thought he could steamroll over me with business folders and smooth talking, he was about to learn that he'd seriously underestimated his big sister. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing Harold's voice saying, "Dad knew that, and he raised me to handle these kinds of responsibilities." The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Not just angry, but determined to find out what Dad had actually wanted, not what Harold assumed he'd wanted. Dad had been meticulous about paperwork his entire life. 40 years as an accountant had turned him into the kind of man who kept receipts for everything and filed documents in perfect alphabetical order. If he'd made specific plans for his estate, there would be records somewhere in his study. I started with the obvious places. Dad's desk drawers, his filing cabinet, the small safe where he kept insurance policies and birth certificates. I found plenty of financial documents, medical records from his diabetes treatment, even handwritten notes about home repairs he'd been planning before he got too sick to follow through. But I also found something that made me pause. Dad's address book was open to a page with Lawrence Fitzgerald's information, and there were several dates written in the margins next to the phone number. Lawrence was an estate attorney downtown, someone Dad had mentioned using for basic legal work over the years. In a manila folder labeled Legal Correspondence, I found letters between Dad and Lawrence Fitzgerald dating back 2 years. The letters mentioned estate planning, property transfers, and something called deed modifications that I didn't understand. But what really caught my attention was a letter from Lawrence thanking Dad for his clear instructions regarding property distribution and confirming that all documents have been properly filed and recorded. Property distribution, filed and recorded. This wasn't just casual legal advice. Dad had made specific official decisions about his estate, and he'd done it 2 years ago, long before his health declined. I kept searching, looking for anything that might explain what these deed modifications meant. Dad's filing system was logical but thorough, and I was starting to feel overwhelmed by the sheer volume of paperwork he'd accumulated over the years. That's when I noticed the locked drawer at the bottom of his filing cabinet. Dad had always been private about certain documents, and I'd respected that boundary when I was helping him with day-to-day paperwork during his illness. But now I needed to know what he'd been protecting. The key was exactly where I expected it to be, in the small wooden cigar box on Dad's bookshelf, where he kept important small items. Inside the locked drawer, I found a large manila envelope with my name written across the front in Dad's careful handwriting. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter, 2 pages long, dated 6 months before Dad died. But it wasn't just a letter. Underneath the pages were legal documents, official-looking papers with notary stamps and raised seals. "My dearest Margaret." The letter began, and I had to sit down in Dad's old chair to keep reading. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're trying to understand what I've done with the house. I hope you'll forgive an old man for keeping secrets, but I needed to protect you from the kind of family fight that would have broken your mother's heart. Dad went on to explain that he'd watched Harold's behavior during Mom's illness, how Harold had promised to visit more often, but never followed through. He'd seen how Harold talked about their parents' assets like future business opportunities, how he'd asked casual questions about property values and inheritance laws during phone calls. I raised Harold to be independent and ambitious. Dad wrote, but somewhere along the way he started seeing family as a financial opportunity rather than a responsibility. You proved during your mother's illness, and again during my own decline, that you understand what family really means. The legal documents told the rest of the story. 1 year ago, while I was busy taking care of Dad's daily medical needs, he'd quietly transferred the deed to our family home into my name alone. The house had been legally mine for 12 months, and I'd had no idea. Dad's letter explained his reasoning. He'd seen Harold's sense of entitlement growing stronger, his assumptions that being the son meant automatic inheritance of the family's most valuable asset. Dad wanted to make sure that the daughter who'd sacrificed her own life to care for her parents would be protected from the son who'd treated family duty as someone else's responsibility. You earned this house through love, not expectation, the letter concluded. I hope you'll forgive me for not telling you sooner, but I wanted you to focus on taking care of us, not worrying about Harold's reaction to my decision. I sat in that study until sunrise, reading Dad's letter over and over again, looking at the deed that showed my name as the sole property owner. I felt vindicated, heartbroken, and completely overwhelmed all at the same time. Dad had known exactly what kind of person Harold was, and he'd spent the last years of his life quietly protecting me from a brother who saw me as an obstacle to his inheritance, rather than a sister who deserved his respect. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove straight to First National Bank downtown. Dad's letter had mentioned a safety deposit box where he'd kept copies of all the legal documents, and I needed to see everything with my own eyes before I could fully believe what I'd discovered. The bank manager, Mrs. Richardson, had known Dad for 20 years. She walked me to the vault, personally expressing her condolences and mentioning how proud Dad had always been of his daughter, the nurse. When I showed her the key from Dad's letter and my identification, she helped me access the safety deposit box that I didn't even know existed. Inside, I found copies of everything. The original deed transfer showing that the house had been legally transferred to Margaret Eleanor Thompson, my full name, including Mom's name as my middle name 14 months earlier. The transfer had been properly notarized, filed with the county, and recorded in all the appropriate government offices. There was also a copy of Dad's will, which I'd seen before, but now I understood why the language about the house had seemed so simple. The family home shall pass to Margaret as previously arranged wasn't vague wording. It was a reference to the deed transfer that had already happened. I found a business card for Lawrence Fitzgerald clipped to a letter explaining the estate planning strategy. Dad had been thorough about making sure everything was legal and binding. He'd even paid for a second attorney to review the paperwork and confirm that Harold would have no grounds to contest the decision. Sitting in that sterile bank vault surrounded by the evidence of my father's careful planning, I finally understood the full scope of what he'd done. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision made during his illness. This was a deliberate choice made while he was still completely mentally competent, designed to protect the child who'd proven her devotion from the child who'd proven his selfishness. I called Lawrence Fitzgerald's office from the bank parking lot. He remembered Dad well and agreed to meet with me that afternoon. When I explained what I'd found, he wasn't surprised. Your father was very concerned about potential family conflicts, Lawrence told me in his downtown office. He specifically mentioned that Harold had been asking questions about inheritance laws and property values. Vernon wanted to make sure his wishes were clear and legally bulletproof. Lawrence showed me the file he'd kept on Dad's case. Pages of notes about family dynamics. Harold's long absences during family crises, my role as primary caregiver for both parents. Dad had painted a clear picture of why he was making this choice, and Lawrence had advised him on the best way to ensure it couldn't be challenged later. The deed transfer was your father's idea, Lawrence explained. He said he'd rather handle potential family drama while he was alive to explain his reasoning, but he also wanted to spare you from having to defend his decision while you were grieving. Lawrence offered to be present when I told Harold about the deed, but I declined. This was between me and my brother, and I wanted to handle it myself. But it was reassuring to know that if Harold tried to claim Dad had been incompetent, or that I'd manipulated him somehow, there was extensive documentation proving otherwise. I spent the rest of that day making copies of everything, organizing documents, and preparing for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of my life. Harold wasn't just going to be disappointed. He was going to be humiliated, especially since he'd already told people in California that he was inheriting valuable property. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in months: confidence. Dad had trusted me enough to make this decision. He'd seen Harold's true character and chosen to protect me from it. After years of being dismissed as the emotional sister who didn't understand business, I finally had proof that the most important man in my life had valued my contributions over Harold's expectations. Harold was planning to meet with real estate agents the next day. He'd called me that morning to let me know not to ask permission, but to inform me of his schedule. He was probably expecting me to thank him for handling the complicated business matters. Instead, I was going to show him exactly how wrong he'd been about everything. I invited the same group back for what I called an important family announcement. I didn't give Harold any details, just told him that before he met with real estate agents, there were some things about Dad's estate that everyone needed to understand. Harold showed up carrying the same leather portfolio from our last dinner, plus a new folder full of real estate brochures and market analysis reports. He'd clearly spent time preparing an even more detailed presentation about why selling the house was the smart financial move. He was in an exceptionally good mood, probably because he thought I'd finally accepted his authority over the estate decisions. He hugged everyone warmly, made small talk about the weather, and even complimented the dinner I'd prepared. Classic Harold behavior: be extra charming when you're about to get everything you want. After we finished eating, Harold launched into his presentation without any prompting from me. He spread out glossy brochures showing recently sold properties in our neighborhood, pointing out features that made our house competitive in the current market. "I've got some really exciting news about our property value," he announced, using the same confident tone that had worked so well at our last dinner. "I've been working with 3 different real estate agents, and they all agree we could get at least $400,000, maybe more, with the right marketing strategy." He pulled out a folder of photographs showing the house from different angles, including shots of rooms that highlighted original hardwood floors and vintage built-in cabinets that were apparently popular with buyers looking for character homes. "The market timing couldn't be better," Harold continued, clearly enjoying his role as the knowledgeable businessman. "Interest rates are still reasonable, and there's limited inventory in this price range. If we list within the next month, we could have a sale closed before summer." Harold detailed his research into comparable properties, talked about staging strategies that could maximize our selling price, and explained how quick sales often resulted in cash offers that eliminated complicated financing contingencies. Aunt Geraldine asked about the timeline, and Harold confidently explained that he'd already spoken with agents about listing dates. Uncle Lloyd wondered about the condition of the roof, and Harold had inspection reports ready to address that concern. Throughout this entire presentation, Harold kept using phrases like our investment and our equity, but his body language made it clear who he expected to make the final decisions. He'd positioned himself at the head of the table again, and he directed most of his explanations to the men in the room, as if their approval was what mattered most. "I know this is a big change," Harold said, looking directly at me with what he probably thought was a sympathetic expression. "But Dad always taught us to make smart business decisions rather than letting emotions cloud our judgment. The proceeds from this sale will set us both up for financial security." Set us both up. That was the closest Harold had come to acknowledging that I had any stake in the decision at all. The most infuriating part was how reasonable and responsible he made everything sound. To our family members, Harold looked like the devoted son who was stepping up to handle complicated estate matters while protecting his grief-stricken sister from having to make difficult choices. I let him finish his entire presentation. I listened to his detailed explanations about marketing strategies and closing costs. I watched him bask in the admiring nods from relatives who were impressed by his thoroughness and business acumen. Then I excused myself from the table, walked to the kitchen, and returned with the manila folder I'd been keeping on the counter. "Before we discuss selling," I said, placing the folder on the table next to Harold's real estate brochures, "there's something everyone needs to know about who actually owns this house." Harold looked puzzled, but not concerned. He probably thought I'd found some old insurance documents, or maybe tax records that he'd need for the sale process. I opened the folder and removed the deed, placing it face up on the table where everyone could see the official seals and legal language. "The house belongs to me, Harold. It has for over a year." The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet, it was the complete absence of sound that happens when everyone in a room stops breathing at the same time. Harold stared at the document for several long seconds before reaching for it with shaking hands. I watched his face change as he read the legal description, saw his name completely absent from the ownership information, and realized that every assumption he'd made about his inheritance was wrong. "This has to be a mistake," he said, but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "It's not a mistake," I replied, pulling out Dad's letter. Dad explained everything. I read selected portions of Dad's letter aloud, including his observations about Harold's behavior during Mom's illness and his concerns about Harold's sense of entitlement regarding family assets. I shared Dad's explanation of why he'd chosen to transfer the deed to me specifically, and his hope that Harold would eventually understand the difference between earning something and expecting it. Harold's reaction was exactly what I'd expected, but somehow worse than I'd prepared myself for. First came disbelief, then anger, then desperate attempts to discredit what he was seeing and hearing. "He was sick," Harold said. "You manipulated him while he was dying." Before I could respond, there was a knock at the front door. Lawrence Fitzgerald had arrived right on schedule, carrying his own folder of legal documents. "Mr. Harold," Lawrence said after I'd introduced him and explained why he was there. "I can assure you that your father was completely competent when he made these decisions. In fact, he was quite explicit about his reasoning and very thorough about ensuring everything was properly documented." Lawrence had brought copies of all his notes from meetings with Dad, including Dad's own written explanation of why he was transferring the house to me. The documentation was extensive and absolutely clear this had been Dad's choice made while he was healthy for reasons that had nothing to do with any influence from me. Harold's final desperate argument was that Dad would never have cut him out of his inheritance completely. Lawrence calmly explained that Harold hadn't been cut out of anything, he simply hadn't been given something he'd never been promised in the first place. The room stayed silent while Harold processed the reality of his situation. His entire plan, all his promises to friends in California, his detailed real estate research, his confident presentations to our family, everything had been based on assumptions that were legally meaningless. Finally, Harold stood up, knocking his chair backward in the process. "This family means nothing to me now," he said, and walked out of the house he'd never actually owned. The weeks that followed Harold's dramatic exit were strange and peaceful in equal measure. He didn't call, didn't text, didn't respond when I tried to reach out to explain that I'd had no idea about Dad's deed transfer until after he'd already made his real estate plans. Our extended family rallied around me in ways I hadn't expected. Aunt Geraldine called every few days to check on how I was handling everything both practically and emotionally. Uncle Lloyd came over the following Saturday to help me box up Harold's belongings from his childhood bedroom, since it was clear he wasn't coming back to collect them himself. Cousin Janet and her husband Bruce stopped by regularly, sometimes bringing dinner, and sometimes just sitting on the front porch talking about Dad and sharing memories I'd never heard before. Mrs. Paula from next door resumed her habit of bringing me vegetables from her garden, the way she used to do when Mom was alive. I made the decision to move back into the family home permanently. My apartment lease was up for renewal anyway, and it seemed right to honor Mom and Dad's memory by keeping their house lived in and loved. I converted Dad's study into a home office where I could do administrative work for the hospital, and I started using Mom's sewing room as a reading nook. The hardest part wasn't Harold's absence, it was grieving the relationship I'd thought we had. I'd spent my whole life making excuses for his selfishness, convincing myself that his charm and ambition were more important than his lack of follow-through when family needed him. Losing that illusion hurt almost as much as losing our parents. I started seeing a counselor who specialized in family dynamics and grief processing. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that I'd been carrying guilt that didn't belong to me, feeling responsible for Harold's disappointment about an inheritance he'd never been entitled to receive. "Your father made a choice based on behavior he observed over many years," she explained during one of our sessions. "Harold's reaction to that choice is just more evidence that your father's assessment was accurate." 3 months after the dinner confrontation, Harold sent me a single email. No greeting, no acknowledgement of how he'd treated me, just a demand for his fair share of Mom's jewelry and Dad's tools. I divided those items exactly in half and shipped Harold's portion to his California address, along with a brief note saying I hoped he was doing well. He never responded or acknowledged receiving the package. Lawrence Fitzgerald helped me understand all the legal implications of inheriting the house. There were property taxes to pay, insurance policies to update, and maintenance responsibilities that came with home ownership. But there were also possibilities I'd never considered before. "Your father set you up for financial security," Lawrence explained. "You can live in the house payment-free for the rest of your life, or you can rent it out for steady income, or you can sell it when you're ready and use the proceeds however you choose. The point is, the choice is entirely yours." That word choice became central to how I thought about my new situation. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't making decisions based on what other people expected from me or what would avoid family conflict. I was making choices based on what felt right for my own life. I started dating again, something I'd put on hold during the years of caregiving. I reconnected with friends from nursing school who I'd lost touch with during the intensity of dealing with our parents' illnesses. I began planning a small vacation, the first purely recreational trip I'd taken in over 5 years. Most importantly, I stopped feeling guilty about Harold's disappointment. Dad had seen our true characters, both his sons and his daughters, and he'd made his decision accordingly. Harold could have chosen to be present during our parents' illnesses. He could have chosen to see me as a partner in family responsibilities rather than competition for inheritance. He could have chosen to treat me with respect instead of dismissive condescension. But he'd made different choices, and Dad had responded to those choices with clarity and legal precision. I found a box of letters in Mom's closet correspondence between my parents during the early years of their marriage, when Dad traveled occasionally for work. In several of those letters, Mom wrote about how proud she was of my compassion and sense of responsibility even as a young child. She described me helping her with Harold when he was a toddler, and later helping with household tasks without being asked. Margaret has such a servant's heart. Mom wrote to Dad when I was 12 years old. She's going to make a wonderful nurse someday, and whoever she marries will be lucky to have someone so devoted to taking care of people. Reading those letters, I understood that both my parents had seen my character clearly just as they'd seen Harold's. The deed transfer wasn't a surprise decision made during Dad's illness. It was the culmination of a lifetime of observations about what kind of people their children had chosen to become. 6 months after Harold's departure, I received a Facebook friend request from someone I didn't recognize. It turned out to be Harold's girlfriend from California, and her message explained a lot about why Harold had been so confident about his inheritance. "I'm so sorry about your family situation," she wrote. "Harold told everyone out here that he was inheriting a valuable property, and he'd been making plans based on that money. I hope you two can work things out." Harold had been bragging about his inheritance for months, probably years. He'd built an entire narrative about his financial future around property he'd never actually owned. His humiliation at that family dinner wasn't just about losing money he'd been counting on. It was about having to admit to everyone in his life that he'd been wrong about his own family's opinion of him. I felt sorry for him, but I also felt relieved. Dad's instincts about Harold's character had been absolutely correct. Harold hadn't just assumed he'd inherit the house. He'd been so confident in his assumption that he'd made public promises based on that inheritance. That level of entitlement, combined with his complete absence during our parents' final years, painted a clear picture of who he really was. As I write this, it's been almost a year since that confrontation at the dinner table. I still live in the house where I grew up. But now it feels like my home rather than a place I was taking care of for someone else. I've made changes that reflect my own tastes, started a garden in Mom's memory, and created spaces that bring me joy rather than just serving practical functions. Harold and I haven't spoken since his email about dividing the remaining estate items. I've heard through Aunt Geraldine that he's doing well in California, but he hasn't expressed any interest in rebuilding our relationship. I've stopped expecting him to. The most valuable thing Dad left me wasn't the house, though. I'm grateful for the financial security it represents. The most valuable inheritance was the lesson that love and devotion should be recognized and rewarded, while entitlement and selfishness shouldn't be enabled just because someone is family. I learned that setting boundaries isn't cruel, it's necessary. I learned that standing up for myself doesn't make me selfish, it makes me strong. Most importantly, I learned that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about people who show up when showing up is hard. Dad knew that Harold wouldn't show up when it mattered, and that I would. He made his decision accordingly, and he protected me from having to fight for respect I'd already earned through years of sacrifice and service. Sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give their child isn't money or property. It's the confidence to know their worth and the legal protection to defend it. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever had to stand up to a family member who thought they were entitled to something that wasn't theirs? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories about family dynamics and inheritance drama. If this story helped you think differently about setting boundaries with difficult relatives, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about finding strength in challenging situations. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who might need to hear that it's okay to protect yourself from family members who don't treat you with respect. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who see your true value, even when others don't. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.